Aisha radiallahu anha, she has embraced Islam basically, yani at her birth basically. She didn't choose to embrace, meaning she is born into the household of Islam. And Ruman has already converted to Islam. Now the question arises that what is her age? When was she born? And the fact of the matter is that this is one of those things I will have to give an entire maybe half lecture or full lecture about, even though I don't want to, but just to talk about methodology and to explain the science of looking at the past, the science of looking at these narrations and trying to sift through. In a nutshell, the age of Aisha has become a very, very controversial issue in our times only. It has never been an issue of controversy for the entire Islamic history. And the age of Aisha was a given. It was something that was understood to be very young. Why? Because there is an authentic hadith in Bukhari and Muslim in her own voice. She narrates that I was 6 years old when the nikah took place with the Prophet ﷺ, and I was 9 years old when the nikah was consummated. And every bit of information that we know fits into this narrative. So why deny it? Is that clear? Everything that we know, including what I just said, I was born and my parents were already Muslim, etc., etc. Everything we know fits into this narrative. So why should there be a controversy? Now, come 2019, the year that we are in now, or go back a decade or two, and obviously the uncomfortable age gap becomes a politically sensitive issue, right? And we all know that the far right uses a very, very pejorative term that, out of respect to the Prophet, I will not even utter, but you know what that term is. And it is now common to for that group of people to describe the Prophet with that very negative, very disgusting slur. And they mention this point of this age gap. And they say this is something that would constitute this crime in our society and culture. And so one of the reactions of those who want to defend the Prophet ﷺ has been to relook at the classical tradition and to derive from it that everybody was wrong for the last 14 centuries, including Aisha herself. Or she made a mistake, or it's a mistake in the narration. And that somehow magically, and I can't help but be sarcastic, and you're going to see my position in the next lecture, that's magically they derive that she was, mashallah, tabarakallah, a perfect 18 or 19 years old, which just completely coincidentally happens to be the age of consent in the modern lands. Right? That's a complete coincidence, of course, yani, quote unquote, I'm being sarcastic here. And so the point is that this issue has become very sensitive, and in order to shed some light on this, and I am against this. This is called revisionism, and revisionism is not always wrong, by the way. This is why I have to be careful here. If there is a real legitimate reason to relook at the past and really sift through the narrations and try to present a different narrative, okay, bismillah, no problem. But in my humble opinion, political correctness is not a legitimate reason. That's really my point. What modern society says is valid and invalid should never be a barometer, a compass for us to judge what is right and wrong. And I am very much against this, completely. And that's one of my main reasons I am very dismissive of what is called progressive Islam, because they don't have a backbone. You know, whatever is the flavor of the month becomes politically correct and becomes Islam for them. And that's not the case. At the same time, it's a valid point, that should not lead us to overreact and become overly fanatical or fundamentalist to defend a past that might not necessarily be valid in the first place. And that's why there's a healthy balance. Sometimes we do need to rethink through. We're not fanatically wed to something that might be incorrect, for example, if it is incorrect. So that's why there is some discussion to be happening with this. For the entire Islamic history, there was never a single peep of controversy. Never. Not one minor secondary opinion, because it's pretty clear. This is a very, very modern i'tirad, a very modern rethinking through, and I am very much opposed to it. So she was married in Shawwal of the first year of the Hijrah. Now, some early historians, a very small minority, say the second year of the Hijrah, but really it messes everything up, and the vast majority, Ibn Sa'ad and Ibn Ishaq and all of them, they say the first year of the Hijrah. So this makes complete sense, and it fits in perfectly as well with the age as well, because she was married at the age of 6.5 or 7, and then the nikah takes place, the consummation takes place at 9, which she herself says. And if you do the math from the death of Khadija the next year up until this, so it's exactly, everything fits in, and it is as she says. And by the way, this is one of my main criticisms of this counter narrative, is that it doesn't just destroy the one statement of Aisha, it basically destroys every fact that we know, and you don't have an explanation of how everything is fitting together, other than, it doesn't make sense that she was 9 years old. Day until it happens. And that was probably the way that they did it back then. I don't know how it was, maybe, but this is, the way culturally, that's what they would have done. And again, one of my main points is that our modern sensibilities, number one, it's not fair to back project them onto another society and culture and time. And number two, Aisha never complained, so who are we to complain or find fault? Aisha never was irritated at any of this, so it doesn't make any sense for some modern, person to then say, oh, that doesn't, who are we? She enjoyed a beautiful marital life. She was the luckiest lady and the luckiest wife in all of history. And who are we then to back project our sensibilities on this? It's a different time, different culture. And the main point, it is not wajib to replicate the culture of 7th century Arabia. Nobody is saying we need to take this and do it in our time. That's the key point here. And I'll jumping the gun here, but I have no problem advocating that in our culture, our time, our era, we can make it illegal in a Islamic system to marry a lady of a young age. No problem. This is masalih and mafasid. It's not wajib to marry a lady of this age, obviously. And culture changes, and urf does play a role in fine-tuning. So if we want to make modern laws, and this happened in a number of countries where some ulama supported, other ulama opposed it. Recently, one country wanted to raise the age to, I think it was 15 or something. Was it 15? Do you know the date? No, I mean your country. Which was the age? The Shura Council. Yes, your country. Yes. 15? La. You're not sure? This last 2 months ago it happened anyway. And then the country below that, the one that they're at war with, they also had another. No, not. There was another age debate as well in that country, and some ulama objected. Some ulama objected, and they quoted this thing of Aisha. And other ulama said, no, the age of Aisha doesn't become a Shar'i benchmark that legitimizes later dates. The age of Aisha was something that was permissible at that time. It doesn't have to be permissible now. And biologically, intellectually, these things change. Ladies become mature, we understand. Although this is not explicit, but it is understood, it's common sense. What happened at 9 that Aisha then became consummated? It's obvious she hit puberty, it's understood. That's the whole point. And in the Islamic religion, puberty is the sign of adulthood. We all know this. And culturally speaking, puberty varies from time to time, place to place, era to era. It varies. And biologically speaking, it used to be that puberty was also the onset of maturity and, manliness or womanliness, whatever. It's our time frame that has reversed this. It's our time frame that has this phase called adolescence, and that complicates things, right? You're neither a child, but nor are you an adult. Whereas in reality, when you hit puberty, you are treated like an adult and you start acting like an adult. So the point is that Aisha, the signs would have been there, and so she is now legitimate to be married to, and so marriage takes place. It's as simple as that. Now we get to the quote-unquote controversial issue over the age of Aisha. I've been referencing this throughout the entire lectures, and now it is time to dive into the deep end. So Aisha's age has been narrated by herself in the first person by multiple chains, reported in Bukhari and Muslim and every single book of hadith. That's the problem. It's pretty explicit and clear. Her own nephew, Hisham ibn Urwa, from his father Urwa, from Aisha. Masruq from Aisha. Others from Aisha. They all report the exact same thing in the most authentic books of hadith, with the chains that are like the sun. They are as bright as the sun. These are called the golden chains. They are the most authentic chains of all of Islam. And they're found in Bukhari and Muslim. And these ahadith are found in Bukhari and Muslim. That Aisha said that the Prophet ﷺ married me when I was 6, and he began living with me. He consummated the marriage when I was 9, and he passed away when I was 18. So first person, narrated by multiple tabi'un who heard it directly from her, and therefore pretty straightforward, right? On top of this, many Sahaba also reported the same thing. Ibn Mas'ud reports and reported in Tirmidhi that the Prophet married Aisha when she was 6 and consummated when she was 9 and passed away and she was 18. This is Ibn Mas'ud is saying the exact same thing as Aisha, right? Jabir narrates that the Prophet married Aisha when she was 7, 6 and 7, okay, similar enough, and consummated when she was 9. Okay, basically the same thing, okay? And on and on and on. In fact, the age of Aisha was something that was of no concern for the entirety of Islamic history. So much so that ijma' has been narrated on this, even though generally speaking, there's never ijma' on historical ages and issues. Yet on this case, for some reason, multiple authors have given ijma'. Of them, Ibn Abdul Barr, he says, I don't know of any difference of opinion over her age. And Ibn Kathir says there is ijma' that the Prophet married her when she is 6 and then consummated 9. Ibn Hazm says the same, and I can quote you many more as well. Now, to be clear, ijma' about historical facts is not the same as ijma' about theology and law. And history is not aqeedah. And hence, somebody who disagrees and somebody who insists that Aisha was, mashallah, tabarakallah, the magical 18 or whatnot, and we don't say this is a bid'ah, we don't say this is wrong, we don't say you've gone against Sunni theology. History is not theology. For us at least, for other group it is, but for us it's not theology. And so from our perspective, if somebody insists and they want to prove it in their way, we say, khalas, this is your opinion. But, and the reason why I'm so interested in going, otherwise it really doesn't matter that much. Remember we talked about the age of Khadija, right? Was she 65? Was she 40 or was she 28, right? And I said, it's not a big deal. And it's like, okay, whatever. And nobody really cares about that. And I just preferred one that it makes sense she was 28. But if somebody insists she was 40, I say, khalas, okay. Yeah, no big deal. In this case, we will say, even if there's no precedence, if you want to insist that Aisha was 18, what can I say? Khalas, good for you. It's not something that you're going to make somebody, a heretic over or something like that. But here is my personal problem with this issue. And that is that wanting to change the age of Aisha represents a frame of mind, a methodology, a paradigm, that once we open this door, once we go down this path, then we will be forced to use the same path or the same paradigm for other issues as well. And for me personally, that paradigm is really one, I'm trying to be respectful because some of my own colleagues and friends are arguing this. Some of the people I know are writing papers about this. With my utmost respect, from my opinion, this represents a somewhat defeatist methodology. Because obviously, understandably, let's be brutally honest here, the age of Aisha radiallahu anha is something that modern sensibilities are going to find problematic. 6 years old, and even if you say a consummation occurs at 9, and our Prophet ﷺ is in his early 50s, okay? It's something that it is atypical in our times. In fact, it would be illegal in most countries in our times. And it is this issue that has caused those who hate Islam to use very derogatory language, and I don't like to even mention this term or whatnot, but because we are talking about this, and I hope you forgive me, I'm simply narrating what they say. Accusations of pedophilia are made, and as Muslims, we are now forced to then respond. What do we do to this response? Understandably, I want to defend, you want to defend, we all want to defend. One of the ways that one groups of scholars have attempted to defend it is simply to reinvent the age. Go back and say, khalas, let's snap our fingers and bismillah, magically she becomes 18. We don't have to worry about this charge. Okay? And this is, overall, this is something that is called historical revisionism. And what this is you go back and you revise history. Something that was well known, something that is almost agreed upon, and some later researcher comes and says, oh, everybody was wrong. This was the real way it was done. And many times, historical revisionism is correct. Many times it's interesting. Many times it's give and take. And many times it's complete, baloney, or whatever you want to call it, okay? Just because it's revisionist doesn't make it right. Just because it's exciting and different doesn't make it right. But it is a theme that people, especially in our times, they love to do. They want to do historical revisionism. But in doing so, we have to be careful, because sometimes when we find something problematic, it shows more about us than about the text. It shows about our prejudices more than it does about the text itself. And even those who are finding this problematic, some of them are mature enough to recognize this. And I'll quote somebody who is a very famous figure of both progressive Islam and Islamic feminism, modern Islamic feminism, Dr. Keisha Ali. She writes in her book, Sexual Ethics in Islam, and she is one of the main leaders of both the progressive movement and of Islamic feminism in our times. She writes, Muslim discussions of the Prophet's personal conduct in general and his marriage to Aisha in particular provide a lens through which to view changed attitudes towards sex and marriage, and unresolved concerns about the appropriateness of applying medieval standards in modern life. There are dangers in both historical anachronism and unchecked moral relativism. That's all academics, they love fancy words. She's saying it's a two-way street. That in the one hand, it is dangerous to say that she is saying this. I'm not saying this. That whatever the Prophet ﷺ did is always morally correct and can be done throughout all history. That's what she is saying. On the other hand, it is also dangerous to read in our prejudices back into history. Okay? So from her perspective, both are dangerous. I will disagree with the first issue, and I'll explain why, and then we'll get to that. So the point is, she is saying that several questions emerge about this whole incident. Then she goes on her way. And we need to be very clear here that before we criticize anything from the past, let us contextualize the past itself, and let us contextualize the present and our own prejudices. Young marriages were the norm around the globe, not just in Arabia. This was the way it was throughout human history up until recent times. Especially marriages of famous people. Daughters of kings, daughters of nobility were regularly married off at a very young age. Their marriages were decided without their consent, absolutely. This is well known. And they were married off at a very young age for political reasons, not for love, not for anything. It was for political reasons. And most of the time, these marriages were meant to actually ratify treaties between two entities or two families or whatnot, sometimes to build peace between two warring countries. The most famous, perhaps, marriage in all of human history was the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Aragon and Castile were two warring kingdoms of Spain, and they were fighting each other. And that's why the Muslims managed to live hundreds of years, right? Well, Ferdinand and Isabella got married. What happened? Those two kingdoms merged, because now their both rulers are there. Now that they merged, they then turned their attention to Abu Abdullah, the last Emir of Granada, and onslaught began until finally. So that's a political marriage, right? Who cares about love? Who cares about anything? Nothing to do with that. It's a matter of getting the two together. Now, these two the concept of political marriages, the concept of young marriages, this was the norm in that time frame. And life expectancy as well was much smaller. Puberty began at an earlier age, norms were different, and that is why in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, even the worst enemies of Islam did not find this issue problematic. This is a modern issue. Only 30 years ago, 40 years ago at max, the first time this was found problematic. Ironically, even authors that were writing about the Prophet 200 years ago in Western worlds didn't really find this that problematic, because even 200 years ago, young girls were married regularly at that age. And that is why, generally speaking, those who accuse the Prophet of this heinous crime, those who use this type of slur, generally speaking, they are not educated. meaning academically. That's what I mean. They might have a high school degree. They haven't studied history. They haven't read. Because anybody who does understands that the age of marriage is very, very fluid. It's very, changing throughout history. And if you look at any things, and again, I could have gone much more detailed. This can easily be given a whole lecture, but I just wanted to clarify because this is the only time I'll probably be speaking about this in so much detail. But I just wanted to mention some facts here that one of the first times the Western world tried to regulate the age of marriage occurred during the time of Caesar Augustus, and he ruled, but he never enforced, that girls should be 10 years old when they're betrothed. 10 years old. That was the law, 1,000 whatever years ago, 2,000, whatever it was, Caesar Augustus. 10 years old. Aisha, they say she was 9. Okay, and this is before that time, and a generation away, and a continent away as well. In medieval Europe, Gratian, the cleric, he's one of the famous founders of what is called the canon law. The Catholics had their Sharia, it's called canon law, by the way, and this canon law was solidified in the 12th century. And he writes in his canon law that the traditional age of puberty, between 12 and 14, he writes, should be the meaningful age of consent for marriage, but he acknowledged that consent can occur even before this age. So he's essentially saying that the norm is around 12 to 14, and he's writing 900 years ago, okay? That is the norm. When Shakespeare wrote his Romeo and Juliet, this is 500 years ago, the actress that played Juliet was 13 or at times 14 years old, okay? 13-year-old, that was and Shakespeare is only 500 years. It's not like 2,000 years or 1,500. Shakespeare, in England, the actress that is playing Juliet is 13. Why? Because biologically and intellectually, 13-year-old 500 years ago is like a 17-year-old of our time, let's say, okay? Like, the age where in our culture, there's passionate love is like 18, 17, right? The first love in our culture. 500 years ago, Romeo is 14 and Juliet is 13. What does that show you? This is just 500. That things change from time to time. And France as well, it has a code called the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code, it considered, and this is only 200 years old, it considered 13 as the age of consent. Consent, not marriage. You understand consent, what they have, their law for consent, right? At the age of 13, a girl can consent. You understand? I don't want to be too explicit. Consent is not marriage. You can get married earlier than that. But 13 is the age of consent in that code. And we have hundreds of court records from England, 15th, 16th, 17th century, and even in colonial America, 16th, 17th, pre-colonial America century, where because of the court records, we have the age of the bride, and the bride is very commonly 10, 11, 12. There's a famous case in Massachusetts where a 10-year-old girl is suing her husband for divorce. She wants a divorce at the age of 10, and it's a famous case because of abuse and whatnot, physical abuse. So she won the case. She's suing for divorce at the age of 10. What age she got married, we don't even know. This is in Massachusetts, in pre-colonial America, 300 years ago. The point being that for us to find that age problematic, it shows more about our culture than it does about theirs, okay? And it's really a sign of our own ignorance when we say, oh my God, she was 9. Well, so what? Yes, she was. How is that problematic? It was the norm back then, and nobody found it problematic back then. And I've mentioned many times in my own lectures, just to be personal here, that when I was a teenager, I found out my grandmother got married at the age of 13, 14, and I was shocked at that. My own grandmother. I know many of you, your mothers and grandmothers were the exact same. Right? That's the reality back then. And I couldn't believe my own grandmother, who I'm talking to in front of me, and she's at that stage 75, 80 years old, and she got married at 13. I was like, how could you get married? And when I was 17 at the time, it's like, are you getting married at 13? How is that possible? And she's like, Bete, all of us got married at that age. Back then, that was the norm. This is literally 2 generations ago, my grandmother's age, and that was the norm back there at the age of 13. So, given the cultural changes, puberty, historically proven that the age of puberty is going up. In the last documented years, it's already gone up 6 years or 5 years, okay? So puberty is going up. Intellectual maturity, we all know that our kids of our age are being put in this bubble of adolescence. We all know this, that they're being, cushioned from the real world much longer than they need to. So biologically, intellectually, Every factor talks about early marriage. And so what if the Prophet ﷺ married at the age of 9? I don't see any problem with this whatsoever. It's not a moral issue. And I want to be clear here. I am not against historical revisionism. I don't mind if there's a reason to do that. If there's strong, compelling evidence on the one side that just doesn't make sense, and we have to go back to our tradition and rethink through things, then no big deal. If it is, it is. But in this case, I really am, with my utmost respect, dismissive of the entire procedure because, in my humble opinion, it simply shows that there's a lack of understanding of culture, of human mores, of sex and sexuality, and because of this, there's this feeling we need to defend in an incorrect manner. And if you're going to cast doubt on the most authentic ahadith with the most authentic chains, you had better have a very strong reason than just to say it's politically incorrect in 2019 America. It's a much more stronger reason than that, and I'm sorry, I don't buy it. Nonetheless, with all of that big disclaimer, now we jump in. What are some of the evidences that is used by the other side? And perhaps the most authoritative article that has been written on this issue is by a modern scholar. Again, all of this is modern. Nobody before our generation found this problematic. Nobody, not a single human being in 14 centuries of Islam found this age problematic until our generation, literally our generation, one generation that we are in now. And one of the most academic authors, because most of those who reject they're not academic, they're just emotional. Oh, how could he have done this? He's rahmatan lil alameen. It's not possible. And whatever your version of Islam is, it has to come from the text. But so one of the most academic articles that I found was by a modern Syrian scholar, graduate of Sharia. He is a sheikh and alim. I will not at all diminish his knowledge from this. And his name is Sheikh Salahuddin al-Idlibi. Al-Idlibi, Salahuddin al-Idlibi. And he has a very detailed article that has been translated into English as well, and you can find this online, the English translation. And he has used what is called source criticism, what is called contextual historical methods, which is valid. I don't have any problem with the way that he does this. So I don't fault him for his methodology, and I appreciate his academic ijtihad. I just respectfully disagree. And I'll summarize some of his points over here, and then I'll refute them. So, in my own words, so he has his, you can read that, but I'm going to summarize them for the sake of time in my own words and order. So, for me, his strongest evidence and the most explicit is the comparison of Aisha with Asma's age, Asma radiallahu anha. And it goes as follows. It has been narrated that Asma was 10 years older than Aisha, fact A, or sorry, not fact A, opinion A. Opinion A, Asma is 10 years older than Aisha. Fact B, Asma died in the year 73 Hijrah. And fact C, Asma was 100 years old at the time. You following? Okay. So put opinion A, fact B, and fact C all together, and from this, if you do the math, so to be very simplistic, so 73 Hijrah, Asma is 100. This means Aisha would have been 90 had she been alive. So 90 and 73 means in the Hijrah she is 13 years old. Okay? Means the marriage takes place at 14. Okay, so you kind of push it up a little bit there. Okay, by the way, you don't get 18 with this one. And that's another point. Every narration gives you different numbers if you do this. Okay? So you get basically around, sorry, you are right in this. Sorry, my bad. Scrap that. The 14 number is coming from the next narration. Sorry, my bad. You're right. So she's 93. So in 73, she is 100. So Aisha would have been 90 in 73, right? And so 90 minus 73 is 17, so she would have been 18. This is where we get the 18 from. Sorry, my bad. Scrap that. The 14 numbers coming from another narration. And that's one of my points. Different narrations give you different numbers because they're all kind of sort of vague in this regard. So, from opinion A or riwayah A and fact B and fact C, we can derive that Aisha was 18. Okay, that's one evidence. The second evidence, I'm going to mention the evidences quickly, then explain them. And I'm going to mention some of his. He wrote the article, and then people gave him a lot of flack and a lot of support. So then he revised the article, and then people gave him some more. So then he writes, there's 3 revisions. So every time he's adding more and more points. So it's still there online. It's online in Arabic and the English as well, summarized. You can read the English as well. So I'm just taking 5 of his main points, or 6 of his main points. The second, there's a hadith in Bukhari. Surah Al-Qamar was revealed, Aisha is saying, while I was in Mecca, and I was a young girl, jariyatan al'ab. I was a young girl playing. Okay? And so from this, if Aisha were a young girl playing, and Surah Qamar is revealed in Mecca, so then, she must be older than 4, 5, 6, when the hijrah takes place. So that's basically a derivation, that the fact that she's jariya al'ab, the connotation being that she's a playful young girl, so she's not going to be 2, 3 years old. Okay, so that's the second point. The third is a lot of snippets and riwayats where Aisha is mentioning things about Mecca. And Aisha is mentioning things about Jahiliyyah. And Aisha is mentioning, for example, she mentions Abu Bakr's journey to Habasha in Mecca, not journey. Abu Bakr's attempt to migrate, right? It's famous hadith in Bukhari, narrated by Aisha, that Abu Bakr wanted to make the hijrah to Abyssinia, right? And he packed his bags, and then Ibn Daghina heard, and he got involved, said, no, you have to stay. So Aisha is narrating. And if Aisha were 2 years old, she wouldn't remember this. And so she must have been older when all of this is taking place. So that's number 3, we can say, all of the various snippets where Aisha is bringing up the past about Mecca. Number 4, At-Tabari in his Tarikh mentions that Abu Bakr married Qutayla, the mother of Asma, in Jahiliyyah, and Roman married in Jahiliyyah as well. And then he lists their children, all of their children, 4 children of Abu Bakr. Okay, so they married in Jahiliyyah. Number 5, authentic narrations in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim that Aisha was helping with the wounded in the Battle of Uhud. And she was giving water, and she was administrating bandages and whatnot. And they argue, it is well known that the Prophet ﷺ rejected 14-year-old in Uhud, he accepted 15-year-old in Uhud, and so Aisha could not have been that young. She must have been older than 15 if she is at Uhud. And Uhud takes place the 2nd year of the Hijrah. And according to the other reports, then she would have been 10 years old in Uhud, or max 11. She wouldn't have been, and yet the Prophet ﷺ rejected people till they were 15 at Uhud. And then the 6th position that they bring, evidence that they bring, is that Fatima and Aisha, there was a 5-year gap between them, according to one report. One tabi'i says Fatima was 5 years older than Aisha. Okay? And then another report says that Fatima was born the year that the Kaaba was rebuilt. So the Prophet was 35 years old. So if you take report A, that Fatima and Aisha were 5 years apart. Report B, Fatima is born in the year of the Kaaba. Then put A and B together. When is Aisha born? When the Prophet was 40. Which would make Aisha how old at the time of Hijrah? 13, 14. And so at the time of consummation, 15. And like I said, even this report, now you get a different number. You don't get 19, 18. I was saying before, you get a different number. This is that different number over here. And then he has other points as well, some of which are weaker, and some of which would require much more to even explain where he's coming from, much less to then, explain the counter. So the response to these 6 points, very quickly, and then inshallah ta'ala we are pretty much done. The response to these 6 points. Firstly, we mentioned the issue of Asma and Aisha, the 10-year age gap. The response is quite simple. This age gap is reported by a tabi'i, and he is not wrong, but he's simply rounding to a number, a vague number. He's rounding, in this case, down, and he's allowed to round down, because in reality, the age gap is probably 13 or 14. Okay, the age gap is 13 or 14. And so if somebody says, Asma was 10 years older, it's not wrong, but it's not mathematically precise. So you take a vague narration by a tabi'i and you use it to abrogate what she herself is explicitly saying. I was 6 years old, I was 9 years old. And the whole Asma, Aisha age difference is clearly shown in the incident of the hijrah. Aisha does not play any role in the hijrah. She's absolutely out of the picture. Her name doesn't even come up except the first time that the camel runs away, and that's her first memory, right? We talked about that last week. Whereas Asma is the one, Ibn Abi Qahafa comes and smacks her. Asma is the one, that in the taqayn, she tears her. Asma is the one who is delivering the food. This must be how old? The youngest is 13. 13 is ma'qul for this, right? 12, 13. And that's perfect. Aisha is basically 10 years or say 8 years or something, around. It doesn't have to be exact. So the age 10, it doesn't have to be set in stone. It's a rough idea, and it is correct to make Asma's age 13, 14 years older. And if somebody were to say there's a 10-year age gap, especially in that era when they're not counting years that much, as you know, it's not a big deal. Whereas for somebody to come later and then backtrack and re-evolve all of history based on this vague narration, which is from a tabi'i anyway, it's not even from the Sahaba, it doesn't make sense. The second issue that Surah Qamar was revealed when I was jariyatan al-abu in Mecca. So this is again a vague term. It's an authentic hadith. What does jariya mean? Jariya in Arabic applies to any young girl who has learned to walk up until she reaches the age of puberty. And therefore, in our English language, we have something called a toddler and we have a young girl. In Arabic, a toddler and a young girl is both jariya. As long as you're waddling away, as long as you're walking along, you are a jariya. You don't have to be 9 to be a jariya. So the fact that she's saying, I was a little girl playing, means she could have been 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9. And the nikah took place and she was 6 years old in Mecca, and therefore she is a jariyah. So it's not a problem that Surah Al-Qamar is coming down and she is a jariyah, because jariyah is above the age of 3. And Qamar is Makkiyah. So she's saying when Surah Qamar came down, I was a little toddler. You can translate jariyah as a toddler. Or even if she said I was a little girl, 5 years old is a jariyah. Clearly. So this is again a vague term that they are reading into too much. Now, as for the issue of Meccan folklore and Jahiliyyah customs, and she's narrating them, this to me really shows they're clutching at straws. Because every one of us knows stories about the era we were born with that we didn't see. Why do we know them? Because that's the talk of the town when you're growing up, right? I was born in the 70s. I have very little memories of the 70s actually, but I can tell you a lot of stuff about the 70s, not because I have memories of it, but because that's what my parents talk about things that are taking place in that day. I mean, I hardly use the rotary phones, tick, 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 tick. I hardly use them, but I know them very well, okay? The LP players, maybe you guys use some of them, the older ones. I never used it in my life, but I know what they are, whereas the next generation doesn't even know the cassette player, much less the LP player, right? It's gone now. The point is, I never used it in my life, right? But I know what it is because it's of my generation, meaning the era I was born into. And so many other anecdotes and stories from that time frame, all of us know this. So what if she's narrating something from Mecca? What do you expect? She's heard it from her father, she's heard it from her elder sister, she's heard it from... That's the talk of the town. In fact, she is narrating things from the time of Khadija, as we know. We mentioned this, right? Early marriage of the Prophet with Khadija. How did she know it? Through the Prophet. So the fact that she's narrating things from Mecca doesn't mean anything at all. As for the issue of Abu Bakr having married Ruman and whatnot before Islam, before Islam doesn't mean that Aisha was born before Islam. Maybe Ruman was married before Islam. The report does not mention that Aisha was born before Islam, and that's reading into the report. As for the issue of helping the wounded in Uhud, and you had to be 15 to participate in Uhud, who can respond to this? Is very easy. You have to be 15 to fight. She's giving water to the wounded. You're the one mixing and matching the 15-year-old man to fight and the wounded giving. This is completely separate. There's no correlation whatsoever. As for the age difference of Fatima, once again, clutching at straws at the point you're trying to create a scenario and extract a narrative. Firstly, all of these are estimates by tabi'un. How old was Fatima? How old was Aisha? It's nothing set in stone. Whereas the age of Aisha is first person in her own words. And secondly, we are reconstructing. One report says there was a 5-year age gap. Another report says that she was born when the Kaaba was being rebuilt. Well, guess what? There is a third report as well. And that third report is that Fatima was born in the first year of the da'wah, not when the Kaaba was being rebuilt. Okay? So if Fatima is born in the first year of the da'wah, this means Aisha is born in the 6th year of the da'wah. This means she is 6 years old when the nikah takes place and everything fits into place. So again, you are picking and choosing what is selective for you. The point is very simple. If she had been 18 years old at the time of marriage, she would have reported many more incidents from Mecca as an eyewitness and not as just something that happened in Mecca. She would not have said, I never met Khadija. She would have had met Khadija because she would have been 15. She would have met Khadija. She never met Khadija. She has no memories of Khadija because she was 5 years old, 4 years old when Khadija passes away. She has no memories of Khadija. So the point is that everything fits. The fact that she's playing with dolls when she marries the Prophet ﷺ. Had she been 18, we don't expect her to be doing that. Had she been 9, it makes sense at that stage when she's just finishing up that phase of her life. All of this. So nothing to be ashamed of. No point to rethink through all of this. And in the end of the day, and with this we conclude with one other point and then inshallah we're done. The age of Aisha is not problematic in the past. I am not saying we need to cut and paste and import to the present. I have no problems, and in fact I'm endorsing this, that in our times there's no problem rethinking through this issue. And a young lady of our times and a young man of our times is not like that of the past. And if Islamic societies raise the minimum age, I am supporting of this 110%. The Sharia does not say that it is not allowed to fine-tune. What it would be haram to do is to criticize what the Prophet did for his time and place. That would be kufr, to be honest. To find that immoral is kufr. But nobody is saying that that issue and the age of Aisha then becomes something we need to import to our times. And it is allowed to look at the time and place where and say, you know what, in our time it doesn't have to be done. And we should raise the age to whatever is convenient for what we agree upon. Even in this state and in this country, there is an ikhtilaf. When is the lowest age of marriage? To this day, I don't know how many, don't quote me, but I think a dozen states allow marriage to 12 or 13-year-olds. To this day, with some permission and whatnot. And in most states, you can get married at 15 or 16, including the one we are in. 15 or something is the age you can get married at. This is to this day. Who's going to decide the youngest age of marriage? I mean, to be, again, a little bit more explicit, let's put marriage to the side. Marital relations in middle school and high school are rampant. Who's going to dictate this? Again, all of these are so easy for somebody who is very ignorant of culture and modern society and classical society to blame the Prophet and Aisha's age. This shows ignorance on the person's part. In reality, there's nothing to find problematic of the past. We do not have to bring it out to our times in the future.